Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm just going to give people a minute or two to join the conference before I get started with the formal introductions. Okay, well, I hope everybody is getting settled in front of their computers and ready to hear our presentation today. I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Kathy Holtzlander, and I'm the Director of Research and Policy for the National Farmers Union, and we're pleased to be a co-sponsor of this event. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Farmland Drainage and Environment Conference. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Shari, Clare, who will be presenting, Does Farmland Drainage Actually Pay? And before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan, including numbers 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Saskatchewan is the ancestral homeland of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, and Lakota, and Denisoulani people, and the homeland of the Métis. We recognize and acknowledge Indigenous values, traditional teachings and ways of being, contributions, and historic inequalities. We recognize that Canada is a settler colonial country and are committed to moving beyond acknowledgement to action, and invite you to join in this work in whatever way you can. The conference organizer, Citizens Environmental Alliance, was created to address the issue of farmland drainage in Saskatchewan, and CEA has partnered with other like-minded organizations to bring you this conference. The Farmland Drainage and Environment Conference series was initiated from a farmland drainage roundtable workshop in Saskatoon in June of 2018, where people with a wide range of interests and backgrounds, including farmers, environmentalists, Indigenous people, academia, local governments, from throughout Saskatchewan came together. One main conclusion from the report was the need for education and communication to change perceptions around the issue. So a few housekeeping notes for this presentation. Your mics are on mute. We will have a question and answer session after Dr. Clare's presentation. We encourage everyone to focus on her talk and avoid using the chat while she is speaking. When we get to the question and answers session following her presentation, I will say more about how we will run that. And if you have a technical problem, please feel free to use the private chat function to send a message to the organizers only. So it's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce Dr. Shari Clare, who will present, Does Farmland Drainage Actually Pay? Dr. Shari Clare is a professional biologist and one of the co-founders of Fiera Biological Consulting Limited, an environmental consulting firm based in Edmonton. She has over 20 years of experience working in Western Canada and specializes in watershed management, wetland ecology, and systematic conservation planning. Over the last decade, Shari has focused a great deal of her professional and academic work on creating better tools and policies for managing wetlands, including more accurate inventories and standardized methods for assessing wetland and riparian habitat condition using GIS and remote sensing technology. She also has expertise in developing and critiquing environmental policy and in ecosystem service assessments, including the use of market-based instruments to improve environmental management outcomes. So Shari, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Kathy. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about this work. This work is a real collaboration. And so before I begin, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues and my co-authors who helped on this work, Brad Danielson, Chantal Koning, and John Pattison Williams. This is a really special kind of project because in order to do it, we really had to have a pretty multidisciplinary team with a whole bunch of different expertise all coming together to lend their expertise to this work. So Brad and Chantal both have GIS and remote sensing expertise. I have a wetland ecology background, and John Pattison Williams was our resource economist on this project. So their contributions were instrumental to us being able to successfully do this work, which, as Kathy mentioned, was really focused on examining agricultural productivity in drained wetland basins in central Alberta. So there we go. So to start, I just want to talk a little bit about what actually motivated this study. And I know for many of you here today, this view is likely one that you've seen many, many times. And in fact, this type of wetland drainage is really commonplace across the prairies. And we estimate losses in the prairie pothole region in Western Canada of between 70 and 90% of wetland area when you compare to what was present prior to European settlement. So we've lost a massive amount of our wetlands in prairie Canada. And this common sight comes with a really typical, I would say, narrative. And this is a narrative that I've heard many, many times over my 20-year career as I've sat in meetings and workshops with folks who work in the agricultural sector, and also from folks who work in government and environmental policy realms. And that narrative is quite simply that draining wetlands increases operational efficiency at the field scale, and it makes more land available for cultivation. So it brings in what most people consider or term marginal lands, and makes those marginal lands available to producers. And these two things combined, increasing the efficiency plus bringing in more area to cultivate, the narrative goes, when you combine those things together, we get an increase in both production and an increase in profits. But as someone who has spent my career working on wetlands here in Alberta, I've never been completely convinced by this narrative, and I've always had a bit of a nagging doubt. And that's because, as this image really clearly shows, despite our very best efforts, wetlands are really difficult to drain completely. And so while there may be some years where we have drier than average conditions, where we get pretty good yields in drain basins, there are also years where the basins are too wet to seed, or the basin is seeded in the spring, but the soils are too wet to grow a good crop and production is below average. And this is really highlighted in this image that I show on screen right now. And so I've always wanted to look more closely at this question: does it pay to drain wetlands? Because, you know, this is something that I was hearing often from folks. And if so, if there really was a benefit to drainage, what is that benefit? Can we actually quantify the magnitude of that benefit? So luckily for me, in 2018, I was able to assemble this team with all the skills that we needed to be able to answer this question. And we were also importantly able to secure some funding to look at this question and specifically try to address it. And so the overall objective of this work was to more carefully examine this narrative that draining wetlands results in a financial benefit for crop producers. And specifically, we wanted to quantify crop productivity in drained wetland basins and compare that to other locations within the same field to better understand the extent to which producers benefit from wetland drainage. And we were motivated to do this because we want to start to have more informed discussions about drainage as a management practice. And so our work was focused on agricultural lands within Camrose County, which is located in central Alberta, about 50 kilometers to the southeast of the city of Edmonton. And we chose this area for our study because it's located in the prairie pothole region. So it's an area that has an abundance of wetlands. But we also focused in this area because our study team had existing relationships with producers in the region. And recruiting producers in a short period of time was really critical to the success of our study. And also having existing and trusting relationships with producers was something that we recognized was going to be really valuable in being able to successfully do this work. So our team initially approached 9 producers within Camrose County who collectively held approximately 70 quarter sections of land in the county. And the focus of the initial contact was to describe the objective of our research, to discuss the willingness of producers to grant our team access to their lands, but we also needed access to their seeding and harvest data. And also to determine which producers would be planting canola in the spring of 2019. And we chose canola as the focus for the study because it's one of the most profitable cash crops in Prairie Canada, and its production value often drives conversion of natural habitats like wetlands to agricultural production. So for those producers who were willing to participate and had fields that would be planted to canola, our team gathered and reviewed current and historical air photographs for each operation, because we needed to identify fields that had wetlands and also had wetlands that had been drained, because we wanted to specifically look at drained basins. So ultimately, we recruited 3 producers who had 4 quarter sections of land that were suitable for inclusion in the study. So in order for us to collect imagery that was useful and helpful for us to identify the wetlands in each of the fields, we flew over each of the quarter sections a total of 3 times during the 2019 growing season. So we did it once in June before the crop emerged. We did it a second time in August, just before the canola flowered. And we did it a 3rd time in September, just before harvest. And we used an unmanned aerial vehicle called the SenseFly EV. That's the little guy in the center photo there that we used to fly over each of the fields. And the imagery from these flights was used to produce an orthomosaic of photographs. So when the UAV flies over the fields, it takes a series of images. And those images are stitched together to create one seamless big picture of the entire field. And that orthomosaic is a very high resolution image, so a 4 centimeter pixel resolution that we obtain from those UAV flights. And from that imagery, we can also create something called a 3D point cloud, which is basically a 3-dimensional model of the terrain of the field. And so we were able to create what we call a bare ground digital terrain model, which basically maps the bare ground in each of the field. And that digital terrain model can be used as an input into a series of other types of spatial and terrain modeling that we find really useful and helpful to map wetland basins and drainage ditches. And so just to share with you some images and maps of some of that terrain mapping and terrain data that we collect and use to map wetlands. This is something that we call a deviation from the mean elevation. And this gives us a really good indication of local topographic features within the field. So here the blue areas show low-lying areas where water either collects or is likely to flow. This is an image that we derive from a model called a probability of depression model, which uses a depression filling algorithm to identify low-lying areas. So again, the darker blue areas show depressions that are deeper and more pronounced, and these areas correspond closely with wetland locations because we know low areas collect water, and also locations where we would expect to see water flowing on the surface. And then this last product is something we call a cost distance to water layer, which again identifies locations on the landscape where there's a really high probability that water is either sitting or flowing on the surface. So we use all of these terrain models and terrain data together, as well as current and historic air photographs, and then also the imagery that we collect with the UAV, to map the location of the wetland basins and to also identify wetlands that are connected to a drainage ditch. So using all of this information, we mapped those basins that we could visibly clearly see a drainage ditch and wetland basins that didn't have any apparent connection to a surface ditch. So both of those were mapped. And for all of the wetlands that we mapped in each of the fields, we also assigned a wetland class based on our Alberta provincial wetland classification system. And in order for us to quantify profit and loss associated with each drained wetland, we created a financial profitability model that was based on a return on investment framework. So for the 2019 growing season, each producer provided our team with a range of different input and operational costs, including costs associated with seeding, fertilizer and chemical applications, fuel, labor, insurance, and machine depreciation. And all of these costs were combined together to calculate an average input cost per acre for each of the operations. Producers also provided us with their 2019 canola yield data, which they collected using their precision agriculture equipment. And so we took this information and we turned it into a raster data set of canola yield with a spatial resolution of 50 centimeters. So basically their precision agricultural data, we were able to turn into a spatial map at a 50 by 50 centimeter mapping resolution, showing us spatially within the field how much canola was produced based on the data from their machines. And we took that yield data and converted it into revenue using 2019 canola and carbon price data and information. And the revenue data was then combined with the input cost information that we gathered from the producers. And from that, we were able to create a spatially explicit profit and loss map for each operation. So within the field at that 50 by 50 centimeter resolution, we were able to map both productivity, but also profit. So we were also then interested in understanding at that field scale what the profitability associated with wetland management looked like. And so then we took our wetland boundary map and overlaid it on that profit and loss map and extracted information for each wetland that we had mapped. In addition to the mapping work, we also conducted producer interviews. So the first interview we conducted was in December of 2019. So this was after our field data collection campaign. And we met with producers to gather information about the 2019 growing season. So this included information about seeding dates, producer impressions about moisture conditions and yields compared to previous years. We also asked them questions to understand their broad environmental sentiments, and also to understand their general attitudes towards wetland management and awareness of provincial wetland policy laws and regulation and policy, as well as motivations for farming. So these were general conversations with producers. We held a second interview in July of 2020, where we then presented to them the results of the profit and loss data. And discussions in this interview were really focused on understanding each producer's impression of the results. So we wanted to know whether our results matched with their impressions of areas in their fields that were highly productive versus less productive, and also whether the results we provided to them would spur or motivate any change to their current approach to managing wetlands within their fields. So what did we find? The first analysis we did was to calculate the average field level input costs and also the average field level profits for each operation for 2019. So there are two important takeaways from this slide. And the first one is that our producers told us in our interviews with them that $100 per acre is considered to be a benchmark price for canola in this region of Alberta. So any profits over $100 per acre are considered by producers to be a good financial return. And that's really what they're hoping to get. And anything below that $100 benchmark is disappointing for producers. The second important takeaway is that when you look at the average profit at the field scale, all of our producers exceeded that $100 benchmark in 2019. And this is despite the fact that 2019 in Alberta was a pretty challenging growing season because we had a really, really wet and cold summer, and fall was also really cold and wet, and it was difficult for producers to get their crop off. So when we showed this data to the producers, they were all, expressed a fact that despite the challenging growing seasons, they were pretty happy with the returns. But what these average values don't tell us is the variability in profit that we see at the subfield scale. So when we aggregate all the information together, we get one number, but when we tease it apart and start looking spatially at where we're actually making profit, there's a different story. And that's what I really want to dive into and examine in a little bit more detail. So these are the profit and loss maps that we created for each operation. And the areas of green show locations in the field where profits either meet or exceed that $100 benchmark. So the darker the green the area, the more profit in that area. Areas in the field that are either gray, white, or yellow are all areas that are below that $100 benchmark. And in the case of the darker gray and the yellow areas, these are locations where input costs exceeded profit. So these are areas where producers lost money. And you can also see from these maps that profits at the field scale is really highly variable based on location. And you also see that there are some holes or gaps in the maps. And these are locations where there was no input or profit data. And so these are areas that were either not seeded or where no crop was harvested off of these areas. So we have no data for those areas. And when we overlay the wetland boundaries onto these maps, you can see that there's a really distinct spatial pattern that emerges. And there's an interesting story associated with profit and losses, with many of the lower profit areas or areas of no data being associated with those wetland basins. So because of the way we mapped the wetland basins individually, we were then able to overlay that information onto those profit and loss maps and actually extract the profit and loss data for each of those individual basins. And again, these maps show that profitability varies pretty wildly between different wetland basins. So the green basins have higher average profits that are above the $100 benchmark, and the red and the orange basins indicate wetland basins where input costs exceeded profits. So when we calculate the average profit for the drained basins, you can see that for each operation, the drained basins are below the $100 benchmark. And for producer 2, these basins actually represent areas of fairly substantial financial losses for that producer. The average profit for intact basins was better than the drained basins. And I should note here that the majority of the intact basins were classified as ephemeral, temporary, or seasonal marshes. And so these are areas that are typically cultivated generally every year by producers because they may be a little bit wet in the spring, but they usually dry up by early to midsummer. And so year over year, most of these basins do get cultivated by producers. And for producer 1 and 3, you can see that profits from the intact basins were again above that benchmark value. But for both of these producers, when you actually look at the area that the intact basins represent, it's quite a small proportion of the field overall. And for producer 2, the profits from the intact basins again fell below that benchmark value of $100 per acre. So I've thrown a lot of maps and a lot of numbers at you in the last few minutes. And so I just wanted to provide a quick summary to really highlight what I think are the primary take-home messages from these data. First, when we only look at aggregate field level profits, it's really difficult for us to understand how wetland drainage contributes to these values. And because most producers only calculate profit and loss at a field or an operational level, the contribution of wetland drainage to overall profit is pretty hard for us to tease apart and really understand. And so the narrative of it pays to drain seems like it might be supported by these numbers when we look at them in aggregate and on average. And given that all of these producers had average field level profits that exceeded that $100 benchmark, if we just left it at looking at these values, we might walk away thinking that it pays to drain is a truthful narrative. But when we look at the profit values associated specifically with the wetland basins, the data tell us a slightly different story, especially when we look at the drained wetland basins. So for producer 1 and 3, they're still making a profit in these basins. So there's no doubt about it. Those basins make a profit, but they're below the benchmark value that the producers themselves told us is sort of, you know, what they're hoping to hit in terms of production. And for producer 2, there's a really clear loss of profit associated with these drain basins. And so this suggests that the practice of draining a wetland might not always yield the profits that producers are expecting or want to have. And in fact, when you compare the average field level profit with and without the wetland basins included, you can see that for all operations, when we exclude the wetland areas, the average profit per acre is higher. And so again, when you look at it in those terms, you can really see that when you drain and produce in those areas, overall, you don't come out ahead. So to highlight this point, when we look at individual wetland basins, 56% of the drained wetlands that we evaluated yielded a financial loss. So over half of them. And 70% of the drain basins were below that desired $100 per acre benchmark. And while the profits for intact wetlands is better, we still found that 30% of intact basins yielded a loss for producers, with over half of those basins producing less than the desired $100 per acre benchmark. So when we shared this data with our producer partners, none of them were surprised that there was spatial variability in profits at this subfield scale, because they really know their lands. They intuitively understand and know that there are particular spots in the fields that have lower yields. So they weren't surprised when we showed them those maps. But they were surprised by the magnitude of some of the losses that we measured, and that was something that was really a surprise to them. When we asked whether the profitability information from this study would change their approach to wetland management within this specific field or across their operations, the producers told us that the results wouldn't dissuade them from continuing to drain surface water from wetlands, or to change their practices with respect to seeding or cultivating within or adjacent to wetland basins. And while, generally speaking, the producers expressed the opinion that wetlands are pretty risky places to cultivate, they still generally felt that draining and consolidating wetlands leads to higher productivity on average and also over the long term. And they also acknowledged that they felt that the weather was starting to be increasingly unpredictable, and that is also elevating risks and uncertainty associated with cultivating within and near a wetland. But even in light of sort of that perception that things are getting riskier, they still felt that over the long term and on average, the practice of draining was still going to overall bring them further ahead in terms of profitability. Producers also emphasize that while making a profit draining wetlands is a desired outcome, it's often secondary to increasing operational efficiency. So they really did hit on this point quite a lot in our interviews, that often the primary goal of draining a wetland is not actually to bring in additional areas of production, but it's to reduce what they termed the endless turning that they have to do when they're driving around a wet spot. And the soil compaction and the input overlap that type of endless turning produces was something that they felt was really undesirable and was one of the primary drivers for making decisions about drainage. So while the feedback from our producers regarding this data, whether this data would compel them to change their management practices, might have some in the wetland conservation community wringing their hands, I do think that this study provides a useful starting place for a conversation about finding what I would call win-win opportunities. By mapping profitability at the subfield scale, we get a much better understanding of which drained basins consistently provide farmers with profits versus those that consistently produce lower yields. And I think this really allows us to identify wetlands that producers may be willing to restore if they understood that these areas don't produce good or consistent profits. So for example, in our study, producer 3 had a total of 44 drain wetlands in their 2 quarter sections. So quite a large number of drain wetlands, but 77% of the profit that they generated from the drain basins came from one single drained wetland basin. So in this case, it seems like there might be a large number of candidates for wetland restoration within those 2 fields. If we, negotiated with that farmer and explained that most of their profits were associated with that one single drain basin, and if there are other opportunities in the field that we could restore wetlands that didn't reduce their operational efficiency and brought in areas that had good conservation value. Again, that's seen as a real win-win from my perspective. There may also be drain basins that are consistently too wet to seed in the spring. So again, when you think back to that map, I showed you those areas of no data, the gaps in the map. Those are areas that producers had to drive around because they were too wet to seed. And so if there are locations in the field like that on average are typically too wet to seed, then again, these areas aren't producing operational efficiency. They're still having to drive around them. And so again, those areas may be important areas for us to focus our conservation efforts on. So while this study illustrates how quantifying crop production at the subfield level can contribute to a more complete understanding of how we manage drain wetlands, there are limitations to this study. But rather than, I guess, stress the limitations, I think to frame it in terms of opportunities for future work. And the first thing is that we used average field level input cost data when ideally we would have used more specific subfield input cost data. But in order for us to do this, we needed producer partners who used variable rate applications. And many producers either don't have this type of data available, or a lot of them, as our producer partners told us, are moving away from variable rate applications. And so from a data availability perspective, it's difficult for us to get this information. Our economic model also didn't include costs associated with creating or maintaining drainage ditches or any nuisance costs associated with retaining wetlands. And we know from the literature that both of these things are really important considerations when you start thinking about economic models. And so including these costs would have made our model and our values more robust. And so again, going forward, I think additional work should really consider including those types of costs in their economic considerations. The other thing is that we acknowledge we only had a single year of data, and that really limits our understanding of how profits fluctuate over the longer term and in response to different climate conditions, as well as fluctuations in crop prices. So marginal values are really influenced by how much canola or other crops are selling for. And because canola is typically rotated with other crops on an annual basis over a 3-year period, we were only able to collect a single year of canola data. And so because we selected a crop that is in a rotation, it was challenging for us to get more than 1 year data because that required a longer term investment in the research and additional research funds, which we didn't have. And finally, the study included a fairly small number of producers. So, going forward, if this is a question that people think is interesting and requires some additional exploration, expanding the study to include a larger number of producers, I think would be really beneficial and helpful. And then also including a more robust analysis of producer views as it relates to wetland management would also likely provide more useful information upon which we can use to design wetland incentive frameworks for agricultural producers. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I also just want to acknowledge that this work really would not have been possible and really hinged on the generosity and support of the 3 producers who are part of this study. And it also would not have been possible without the funding support from the Alberta Conservation Association and the Alberta NAWAMP partnership. So I want to thank our producers and our funders for their help with this. And also we have a paper that was published in Wetlands Ecology and Management. I have the citation there. I also provided a link to that to someone. I think Lindsay is going to post that in the chat. So if you're interested in obtaining a copy of the publication, that should be available to you to download if you're interested. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Shari. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure people have lots of questions. So here's how we're going to do the Q&A. To ask your question, please raise your Zoom hand, and I'll call on you, and you can will unmute your mic so that you can ask your question. And ask people to be fairly brief with their questions so that we can fit in as many questions as possible. And if your computer does not have a microphone, raise your Zoom hand to indicate that you would like to ask a question, and then type your question into the chat and I'll read it out loud for you. So I think you'll see the Zoom hand at the bottom of your screen, or I think if you're on a smartphone, there's 3 dots in the corner that you can click on to find your Zoom hand, and then just click on that, and then I'll recognize people in the order that they raise their hands, and we won't be taking questions directly from the Zoom chat. We'll just take them orally. So go ahead, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And somebody is sharing a screen, it looks like. Shari, is that you?
Sorry, yeah, I had just looked at one of the questions asking about precipitation, so I was pulling up some precipitation data. Sorry.
Okay, so would anybody like to ask a question? I don't see any hands yet.
Yeah, for sure. So we have Ross McDonald. We'll get you to unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Ross. Ross, if you could state your question, please. Or do you not have a microphone? Ross, are you able to ask your question? Okay, maybe we could go to somebody else.
Yeah, all right. So Jamie, so what will happen is you should just see a little pop-up that says that you've been requested to unmute. So if you want to just click that, and then you should be good to ask your question.
Hi, Shari.
Hi.
Hi. Did I hear you correctly? Did you say that producers are moving away from variable rate?
The producers that were included in our study, that was actually something that they spend a lot of time in the interviews talking about. A lot of them express, I mean, it was only 3 producers, so whether or not this is representative of the majority of producers, several of them indicated to us that they were really unhappy with the variable rate and that they didn't find that they were seeing good enough results to justify the cost, I guess. And they also, some of them were frustrated with the service provider and accessing information from their machinery, and also just the costs associated with using that technology. And so some of them had suggested to us that they were moving away from variable rate. And one producer in particular didn't use variable rate at all, had never adopted that practice. So again, I don't know if that's something that is common or typical, or is just sort of an unusual circumstance, you know, specific to these 3 producers.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks. So I guess, Ross, do you want to try your microphone again? Is that been fixed? Okay, if not, I'll read Ross's questions out loud. So he's wondering if the producers are owner operators, and whether the analysis includes an increase in cultivated acres per parcel and a corresponding increase in land assessment values for that parcel. And were producers asked what dollar value per acre they would encourage them to stop draining and maintain wetland vegetation?
So for the question of were producers owners and operators, yes, for all 3 of the producers that we worked with, they were owners and operators of the fields that we assessed. So I will also caveat, I'm the wetland ecologist, not the resource economist. So some of the economics questions I will try to answer, but may not be able to give you the most satisfactory answer. John Pattison Williams was our resource economist. And if you're interested in reaching out to him to ask specific questions about the economics piece, I'm happy to provide his information to you. So in terms of your question about an increase in cultivated acres per parcel and corresponding increases in land assessment values, we didn't do any of that. So again, I think one of the things that we really identified as on a go forward to really refine the economic values that we developed is to create a more robust and more nuanced economic model. So this really was a pretty quick and dirty assessment of the economics and the various costs that go into that. So certainly the economic modeling can be refined going forward. Your question about what dollar value per acre would encourage them to stop draining and maintain wetlands, we didn't ask that question. That's a really good question, and certainly something I think again, going forward, if we were to do this study again, we would really focus more efforts on sitting down with producers and having a much bigger and more robust list of questions that we would ask them. Because again, I think their willingness to accept payments and also willingness to adopt certain practices is really hinges on some of these economic values, and trying to glean from them what those values might be is really important.
Yeah. Thanks, Shari. Are there any more questions, please? Raise your Zoom hand and I'll recognize you.
Yeah, so Kathy, I think if you click the participants list, you can see the folks with their hands raised.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so the next up is Sean, and Sean actually put his question in the chat saying that he doesn't have audio. So if you want to read out his question,
Sure.
That would be great.
Okay, so Sean's question is, in the producer interviews, I think you asked them about their impressions about moisture conditions. Did you also utilize data regarding antecedent soil moisture as well as other parameters?
So we did a climate analysis. This is the data in terms of climate analysis. So you can see that basically what this graph shows is month over month for each year, so this is 2018, 2019, 2020, if the month is red or orange or yellow, it's sort of drier than average, and the warmer colors are above average moisture conditions. So you can see here for 2019, we actually had quite a dry winter, so not a lot of snow falling. But June and July were really, really unusually wet. And those moisture conditions really persisted into August and September. And then in October, it got really cold and we saw less precipitation. So, over the growing season, I would say 2019 was really abnormal in terms of the amount of moisture we saw. We didn't have soil probes or anything like that where we were actually measuring soil moisture conditions. So again, it was more of a qualitative look at historical averages and also conversations with producers.
Great. Okay, our next question is Murray Heidelbaugh. Murray, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Shari, I was wondering, Alberta has a rapid assessment tool for wetlands, and I was wondering if it was possible to look at some time, or if it would work if you've looked at whether the value of the wetland that's being drained could be put into the equation or the model to look at actually what the cost of draining that wetland was in terms of the overall calculation, the farmer's profit plus the cost minus the cost of the wetland as well.
Yeah, certainly that's something that, again, in terms of prioritizing areas that you might want to target for restoration, if you have, a field with those 44 drain wetlands, you could consider, both the input from the farmers in terms of which areas they would want to target, where it wouldn't interfere negatively with their production, but then also targeting areas where, from a wetland ecology perspective, we would expect to see the most benefits from a conservation perspective. So certainly the Alberta assessment tool is something that we can use. I would say that, it's a useful tool, but there are also other ways to prioritize, but certainly the benefit of using that particular tool is that you can also use a desktop-based assessment to do that. So that tool has been designed to assess both in the field, but then also to get a condition value based on some desktop assessment, which again, at a larger sort of spatial extent, would allow you to prioritize areas. So I think, yeah, having both of those pieces of information, both information about which wetlands might produce the best ecosystem service value, best conservation value in terms of wetland function and hydrologic function, but then also making sure that we're also having the conversation with the producers about maybe there are trade-offs. We don't get the highest value wetlands put back, but we're putting back wetlands that still have relatively good ecologic and hydrologic value, but also are wetlands that producers are willing to put back because they're not really interfering with their production.
Great, thanks. So Candace, you're next, if you could unmute yourself.
I'm not sure why it says Candace, but anyways, my question is, if it wasn't properly drained, and in those wet years, I'm assuming 2019 had lots of water, if it wasn't properly drained, the water would then be creeping out into the cropland. Then you would having yield deductions within the areas of the field, not?
Yeah, we were seeing that again. If you sort of look, I'll just kind of go back to, sorry, some of these maps. We were seeing instances, not sure why.
Because I'm actually seeing from your results, we have some yield data that is proving the exact opposite. if it wasn't properly drained via tile, the water would then creep out further into field, then be net affecting, taking away fertilizer and yield in the actual field.
Say that again?
So if it wasn't properly drained and you
Yeah.
had a high rainfall year like 2019,
Yeah.
how much water was in 2019?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
In Saskatchewan, those areas in 2010, 2012, and 2014, those areas would then creep into the field, then be taking away cropland that was seeded. So what I'm saying is if 2019, if that wasn't drained in those areas, it probably would, your yield data would have been less in the actual field, not?
Possibly, yep. That's a great point, yep.
It would be. It happened in Saskatchewan for
Yeah.
3 years. So by saying 2019 that those areas are not profitable, I think it actually saved your field within the 120 or 130 acres that was seeded. So I think you need multiple years of data, and I think you would have a complete reversal of that data if it was done in like 2021. I think you'd actually see the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit on the importance of having multiple years of data. I think that trying to understand the spatial dynamics of how soil moisture affects productivity in different areas of the field relative to where those wetlands are. I think this is certainly an incomplete picture of that. But I think it does raise the point that thinking about management at the subfield level rather than on aggregate is again, if our objective is wetland conservation and wetland management, then we have to really start understanding what's happening at that subfield level.
For sure. And there's actually some great research going on right now in Saskatchewan with that, VRing and then soil testing those areas, and then fertilizer being reduced in those areas where there'd be less overlap. And the comment on less VR, I would quiz other farmers on that, because I think the uptake is huge right now, to the difference of $40 to $50 an acre that will be different this spring on fertilizer.
Right. I think, the other important point to make, I think is sort of the flip of what you've said. In wet years, if you're not draining, you're going to see impacts to productivity adjacent to basins, because it would be really, really wet and that moisture would creep out. I would also argue, and I don't have the data to support this, but in drought years, I think you're going to see better productivity along the margins of wetlands also. So I think, again, it's this push and pull in terms of benefits and costs associated with wetland retention. So wetland retained in fields during drought years or going around those areas are likely going to benefit from soil moisture that is better condition from the rest of the field because it's adjacent to a wetland, and also sort of nutrient, this sort of halo effect of having a retained wetland. So again, on average, over multiple different climate conditions, it's really important for us to understand this question.
Yeah,
Okay, we're going to go to the next question now. Lyle, if you could unmute yourself and go ahead, please. Your microphone is still muted. Lindsay, can you look up there?
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Wouldn't go off for a sec. Yeah, thanks. Interesting, valuable presentation there, Shari. Couple of points that have been partly raised, but especially interested. I know you weren't able to cover this, but the initial cost of installing drainage works appears to me to be a major factor, because it looks from your data that the payback period would be very, very long at these low profitability rates. And if drainage, when drainage costs are actually subsidized either directly by farm programs or even by being able to claim those expenses, it actually is a burden on the public to be allowing farmers to recoup or offset costs of drainage, when in fact, if it's not paying, why do we allow that? And then I'm especially interested in tile drainage. From what I understand, is extremely high initial costs. And so at some point, it'd be very interesting to see how long a payback period it would be, especially if there was not an ability to offset those costs. And just quickly to say, this is to let alone even looking at the long-term environmental costs of the hydrological services that are provided by wetlands, which you just recently touched on. But I think this is a huge factor that needs to be equated in. I will be very curious as well this coming year in the dry areas, how this loss of water on the land will in a long-term affect our future viability on a dryland farming area. Thanks.
Thanks, Lyle. Yeah, I agree with you entirely that, again, we didn't include costs associated with either the creation of those drainage ditches or the maintenance. And again, to get a more robust, fulsome picture of the economic costs and benefits, including considerations around the type of drainage, and then also the costs associated with installing and maintaining that drainage is really important. In this area of Alberta, we don't see a lot of tile drainage. It's more common in southern Alberta. And so that wasn't something that was really on our radar for this particular study, but I know increasingly it's being used in southern Alberta and elsewhere on the prairies. And so I think it's really important for us to start making sure that we're considering costs associated with that.
Thanks. Okay, now we'll go to Jeff. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks for the very informative presentation. Just concentrating about Saskatchewan again, I would like to know if you think you'd see similar results in areas of high drainage in Saskatchewan, say east central parts of the province. And I think someone alluded to the fact that there might be some research going on there, but perhaps you'd consider coming and doing some over here. And do you think that type of research for tile drainage over here might be a good thing to do?
Yes, I mean, certainly I think there's a lot of similarities between this region of Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan. So I do think that, the results are generalizable to other regions in Prairie Canada for sure. I did give this presentation a few months ago to the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture, and there was someone from the Saskatchewan government, Etienne, I can't recall his last name, but he told me after that presentation that the Saskatchewan government is collecting data and doing something very similar to what we did in Alberta. And I don't know, I've been meaning to reconnect with him and understand what they're doing in a little bit more detail. But my understanding is that they have collected data on quite a large number of fields, and their intention is to do something very similar in terms of calculating profitability associated with drainage. So I think some of this work is already in motion in Saskatchewan. I don't know a lot of the details about it, but certainly I think overall, if our objective is to have more informed conversations about how to approach wetland retention and also restoration, and develop policies or implement plans and programs to achieve better outcomes in terms of conservation and restoration. We really need to understand the economic drivers that influence individual farm decisions. And I think what's really challenging about this issue is that there's a huge heterogeneity in costs, in profit, in individual decisions that are being factored in, and each farm is unique. And, you know, that's a really challenging policy environment because we want to have general policies that sort of, you know, big umbrellas that sort of capture the majority. But I think in this case, the nuance of how decisions are made at the field and operation scale are really, really important drivers of wetland management decisions. And we need to start acknowledging that and trying to come up with tools that can help us have more individual conversations while also, you know, under the larger policy umbrella of wetland conservation. So what that looks like, I think, is taking advantage of the technology that we have. Producers have this type of information. They have machinery that's collecting it. We need to capitalize on that information to help inform those conversations with them.
Thanks. I don't see any more hands up. Is there anybody that has thought of a question would like to ask? You could raise your hand now. Well, maybe while people are thinking, I had a couple of questions that came to mind, Shari, if I may. You talked about the importance of operational efficiency as a perhaps even more important consideration than the profitability on the land. And I'm wondering if it might be interesting to look at farms that maybe aren't using the larger equipment that is equipped with a precision agriculture data collection tools, but perhaps is a bit more nimble in terms of how it covers the land, but you wouldn't have the fine-grained data on inputs and yield. But I wonder if there might be a way to design a study that didn't depend on the data collection, but could look at is the use of smaller equipment that's more nimble potentially a way to make retaining wetlands a bit more attractive. And then another question I have is when we look at input prices being quite a bit higher, which is what people are facing this year with you know, really high increases in how much fertilizer costs, the profitability equation is going to change quite a bit, and it may then, you know, you don't really want to waste fertilizer putting it in areas that are going to be too wet to grow a crop. So two things, the varying prices of inputs and the type of equipment used.
Yeah, again, I think, you know, the size and the type of equipment that you use is, again, a really important consideration, and sort of goes back again to like the unique farm level characteristics that are driving decisions. And I do think that bigger machinery is harder to move around through the fields. And so in those cases, driving straight is really the imperative, and driving through wetlands, because it's really hard to navigate big machinery around that, is something that's really driving the decisions to drain more than anything, I would say, in terms of, you know, the profitability is sort of secondary to that. Whereas I would say for, I would guess that operators that have smaller equipment, that sort of decision and trade-off is a little bit different. And so again, how they factor in the decision to drain and the efficiency piece is also, I think, really important to understand, but it's very specific to each farm or operation. And one of the things that our producers said to us in our interviews, because we had such a wet and cold fall, they were having a really hard time getting their crop off. And so in this case, being able to get into the field and quickly do the work and get it off as fast as they could was really the imperative. And so again, from the perspective of, if I'm going to spend 2 hours in the field, if I only have 2 hours before it starts raining again, I need to be able to get as much work done in that short period of time as is possible. And so they were really thinking about productivity and efficiency in terms of number of man hours available for the amount of work that had to get done. And so they were framing that from the perspective of how can we manage this field in a way that gets the highest level of efficiency to get in and get out really quickly. I think that, you know, the other question of fluctuation in input costs, but also, you know, how much is the crop selling for is also a really important dynamic. Part of the reason why we selected canola and not other crops is that we know that canola is, you know, a pretty valuable cash crop. And so if we were seeing fairly marginal profits with canola, if we looked at other crops, we were likely that margin would be much smaller. And so I think the canola is really informative in that perspective. But, you know, if the price of canola goes through the roof, then the decision to crop those marginal areas is also becomes more and more attractive. And so again, there's a real push and pull between what the market is the signals the market is giving us, both in terms of inputs, but also in terms of what we can sell the crop for, that is so situational, and it's really year by year, which again, that having that longer term view is important, and makes this a really, really challenging, difficult topic and issue to really wrestle with and understand. And I don't think we will ever completely understand all of the dynamics. I think what's really important is that we come to the table thinking about all of these things and being willing to try to understand how each of these things may be influencing decision-making and how we might be able to capitalize on opportunities to set aside areas that may not be great for farmers that could have benefits for wetland conservation.
Great, thanks. That sounds like a really good wrap up, Shari, and it doesn't seem like we've got any more people waiting to ask questions. So I think maybe we can just conclude that part of the presentation now. And thanks again so much for your presentation, Shari, and for everybody who attended. It's great that we have so much interest and your participation with your questions and listening to the answers. That's really great. So Lindsay, I'll just get you to put up the slide for concluding things. And so, yeah, you can find out more information about farmland drainage and what you can do by contacting the Citizens Environmental Alliance. You can check out their Facebook page, and you can like and follow and share it. And you can also find the recordings from this conference on the CEA YouTube channel. And if you're interested in reading the Insitrix report that was part of, you know, organizing this whole series of conferences, you can find it on the Saskatchewan Environmental Society website under publications /water, and that's the website that's posted right there on the screen. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us at the Farmland Drainage and Environment Conference. Of course, this isn't possible without our supporters, and whose logos are there on the screen. Thanks to everybody who supported it. And tomorrow there will be another session, and this one will be with Jeff Olson, who is the Director of Citizens Environmental Alliance, and he will be providing an update on the status of farmland drainage, the environment, and wetland policies in Saskatchewan. So with that, thanks again to Shari and the organizers and everybody who attended. And we'll call it a day. Thanks again, and goodbye.